Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today, we've got Daniel McAdams back, the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute, our very own foreign policy expert. Of course, the Ron Paul Institute, founded by Ron Paul and Daniel back, what is it now, 10 years? More,
12.
13 years?
Yeah, 12 years, yeah.
12 years, okay. Right after Dr. Paul finished his congressional career, and of course, we've been talking about a number of things happening with foreign policy for the past couple of years, especially the Ukraine war. And Daniel, first of all, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me back, Tom.
Yeah, great to have you here. And what caught my eye the other day, and I think we tried to get together when you first did an analysis you did that I want to talk about, was an article that came up, and I'm going to read two paragraphs of it. It's titled How Putin Missed His Shot at Peace. And let me read these two paragraphs and make one comment, and then I'm going to ask you for your opinion on this. So this is in Time magazine, and it says, on Thursday in Istanbul, the empty seat reserved for Vladimir Putin perfectly symbolized Russia's unwillingness to end the war in Ukraine. Putin's counterpart in the negotiations, Volodymyr Zelensky, had spent days calling on him to show up and face him. We are ready to talk, the Ukrainian president said, to end this war. But Putin stayed away, demonstrating his disdain for the peace process and handing Zelensky a tactical victory. For the Russians, it was the latest in a string of diplomatic stumbles. President Donald Trump and his envoys have tried for months to engineer a ceasefire in Ukraine. Along the way, they have given Putin plenty of chances to steer the Americans into his corner, but the Russian leader missed every one of them. So the gist of this, Daniel, is that here's the United States coming in there, trying to make peace between these two countries. And it doesn't seem like either one wants to work with the United States and even make the slightest concession. And they're saying, well, Putin missed a chance here because he could have swung the United States into his corner. What's wrong with this whole analysis?
Well, what's wrong is it was Time magazine. It's a CIA's organ, it has been for decades. It's the most absurd piece of propaganda that I've heard in a while, and that says a lot. The fact of the matter is Russia's winning the war. Why are they desperate for peace talks? Why would they be desperate to have the U.S., which has been funding and participating in the war on the other side? Why would they be desperate? Why would they be desperate for an off-ramp, Tom? That's like, you're in a football game. It's the fourth quarter. You're up by 2 touchdowns. You don't call timeout and say, "Hey, let's just call it even." Let's freeze this conflict. It's absurd. And the idea, this is basic diplomacy, and they can't be this stupid. Someone gives them these talking points, because if they really were going to have peace talks, you do not send the presidents of each country first. It never happens that way. It never in history happens that way. You send your team of experts. You send your negotiating teams. They hammer out a deal. Sometimes it takes days, usually weeks, sometimes months, sometimes years it takes. And then when everything is hammered out, then there's a signing ceremony. That's when the presidents come and they sign, and that's when it happens. So this whole idea that Putin is crouching in Moscow somewhere, terrified, of going to Istanbul for these talks, it's so absurd, and it relies on Americans being so ill-informed that they don't know the basics about the conflict. It's probably true.
One of the things you talked about was the problem with even seeing the U.S. as a mediator in this. And I think it's really funny, because I can't even remember how many years ago it's been now, because the war's been going on for 3 years. But at some point, I know I wrote an article called Putin is Not at War with Ukraine. And the gist of it was, besides the shocky title, was to say it's really a proxy war of the U.S. and NATO against Russia. And now I think, as you pointed out in a great, I don't know if it was an X video, but I watched it. The U.S. really isn't a mediator here, are they?
You can't pretend to be a mediator when you're clearly a participant on one side. The negotiations would be a peace talks between the U.S. and Russia, because without the support of the United States and to a lesser degree NATO allies, much lesser degree NATO allies, the war would never have gone this far. The war would have been over, in 2022 probably, or at least in 2024, it would have been over. So the U.S. has sent, $100 billion, literally everything we have, every weapon we have. One of the reasons we had to, fortunately, but one of the reasons we had to stop bombing Yemen is we ran out of missiles, and they were starting to hit our planes. But nevertheless, the missile supply is extremely low because we sent them all to Ukraine, and the same is true for all the European countries. It's weird how we're having demilitarization through this conflict in Ukraine, but no, you're participants. The U.S. is a participant. You can't pretend that you're the peacemaker when you're on the other side fighting. It's absurd. I made this sort of comparison in an interview I was in a little while ago. It's like if you're in a boxing match and the referee starts punching someone.
Yeah, it is absurd. And I want to put this on screen for people. I like to try to reset people so you can see that map, correct, Daniel?
No, I'm afraid I don't see a map. I see. Oh, there he is. I see it now.
Okay. And for all you folks at home, just to get an idea of, where everybody is in this conflict, this is Ukraine, the lightly shaded area that includes Crimea way down here in the Black Sea. And up here to the north, you can see to the northeast is Russia, directly north is Belarus, to the northwest is Poland, and down here directly to the east and the southeast is Romania. So that's the neighborhood that Ukraine is in, and it shares all this border with Russia right here where you see my cursor. And a lot of people have heard about the breakaway provinces, Luhansk and Donetsk. I'm probably murdering those names. Those are right here in the far east, and I'd say somewhat north, but the east of Ukraine. These are the provinces that broke away. And again, Crimea is down here. So at the beginning of the war, there was a push towards Kiev by Russia, I think coming from the north and also from the east. But for the most part of this war, that ended pretty quickly. Putin claims that he did it voluntarily because he was asked to start the peace negotiations. Whether that's true or not, we have no idea. That's his story. Of course, the other side of the story is we defeated them and pushed them back. But the rest of the war, as far as I can tell, has not changed, which is right where my cursor is Kharkov or Kharkiv, however you pronounce that. And just south of that, there's kind of a banana-shaped area. It goes through both those provinces. It goes through Mariupol, which was captured by the Russians early in the war, and it went all the way to right here in the south called in Kherson. Now, the Russians had captured Kherson sometime in 2022, and at one point they had to give it up, and they retreated south of Kherson and did a new line. And you can see that south of this banana-shaped, as Colonel Douglas McGregor said, great description, this banana-shaped area of Ukraine, really nothing has changed in the last 3 years. Since Russia started occupying that, there's been pushes forward, falling back. There's been little gains in territory or not. But basically, Russia's in the same place they've been for 3 years. Would you agree with that, Daniel?
Well, to a degree, I would, but it's more complicated than that. But they haven't taken over all of Ukraine. They haven't gone up to the Dnieper River. That is true. But they did announce from the very beginning that this is a war of attrition. It's not a war for territory. And that's what most Americans can't understand. We view however many kilometers you capture as whether you're winning or not. Russia very early on announced that their goal is to demilitarize Ukraine. And that's what they've done. They've killed maybe 200,000 or 300,000, probably more, 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. The equipment has been destroyed. NATO has been depleted of its weapons. So it's been demilitarized. So it's almost like apples and oranges. It's not a war for territory.
Yeah, good point. And the other thing about this area that I'm pointing out on the map is that this is generally, there's no absolutes here, but this is generally where the Russian speaking population of Ukraine has come. So when you hear these people say, you know, I don't know if Zelensky's still saying this, but at one point he was saying, not 1 inch of Ukrainian territory remains in Russian hands. This has been Russia for 3 years, effectively. In Crimea, it's been 10 or 11. So, is there any chance, in your opinion, that Russia gives up any of this territory they've taken if they had a chance for peace, even though they're holding all the cards? Would it be to their advantage maybe to give up any of this?
No, not at all. They won't. They won't give it up. They've already incorporated those provinces into Russia, part of the constitution. It's part of Russia now. The question is, and it came up in the talks in Istanbul over the past couple of days, came up on Friday, where the Russian side said, well, you need to completely leave these provinces that are part of Russia now. And they said, well, you expect us to leave these 4 provinces? And this is reported by the head of RT, who said that, she had a reporter that certified this is what happened. And they said, well, you want us to leave 4? And they said, well, no, our next offer will be you leave 8. So, this is what happens when you deplete the military of the other side. And even the U.S. military, I forget which one of the NATO commanders, U.S. general, said that Russia is making more weapons than it was when it started the war, and that's certainly not the case for Ukraine. So you don't sue for peace when you're winning. It's just basic. Why would you sue for peace when you haven't achieved all of your goals? And it's not to say that I want Russia to take over more territory. It's not really my business, but understand, we didn't, get to the outskirts of Berlin in World War II and say, okay, guys, okay, Hitler, you can keep your city. It's all good. You don't do that when you're in a war, especially as Russia said, they view it as an existential war. You just don't leave. It's never been done in history. There's no incentive to do it. And
And
Russia
on
is
top of
accelerating. I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. On top of the fact that, yeah, they've won the war, they took the territory that they want, they sat down in it, and basically just completely depleted Ukraine's capacity to make war, and even, some of NATO's capacity to make war. And in addition to that, early on, the United States decided to, I can't remember what the polite term is, but basically steal 300 billion of Russia's funds, cut them out of the US dollar system. So they've really given them nothing. At that point, Russia just had really nothing to lose and nothing to gain by coming back.
And yeah, and the de-dollarization that we thought was a punishment to Russia actually wasn't. It forced Russia to create new ties, to become more involved with BRICS, to do more development with China, and now they're doing an enormous amount of development with China, with India. They had like 4.2% GDP growth last year. That's unheard of. They asked the Germans what their growth is like. And, it's not to say that the loss of trade. You and I, sure, speaking for you, Tom, trade makes you wealthy. Trade is a good thing. It's always good. But isolating Russia just forced them to find new trading partners and to find ways around the dollar. And so that's why the dollar, we basically shot ourselves in the foot by doing this, by isolating Russia. It's an own goal.
Yeah, and it's funny because Washington has always treated them like, like a second-rate country, I think. I think that's one of the problems here. Ever since the Soviet Union fell, Washington took the position like we won, like almost like they were Berlin, and we won a kinetic war. But there was a long period where it seemed like Russia and Putin wanted to be part of Europe, wanted to be counted among, the G20 or G7 or whatever group you want to call it, went to all the Davos meetings, and really that was kind of like a line in the sand, I think, when they did that, when they cut them off from, I can't remember the system that administers the dollars. What's it? Do you remember what
SWIFT,
it's called?
The
SWIFT,
system,
right.
yeah.
They cut them out of the SWIFT system. So here's a question, just speculative that, we know that Trump campaigned this war should never have happened. In my position, it should never have happened. Your position. That wasn't the Biden administration's position. Had Biden won the election, do you think that because of all the things you said about depletion of U.S. missiles, the money that's been spent, how the war's really gone, do you think we'd be in the same place anyway? Or would the Biden administration and NATO try to keep this illusion going?
Well, there's only a limit. There's a limit to what they can do. The war is going to go the way the war is going to go. Russia has already defeated the best weapons that NATO has. It's just a fact. You know, Trump had a tremendous opportunity when he was first elected to say, okay, this was Biden's stupid war. It was started under Obama. I want no part of it. I was elected to end wars. The U.S. is now fully out. You want to go for it, Germany? Knock yourselves out. You want to try to go back to Moscow again? You've been there, you've done that. Go for it. You're on your own, guys. But we're not going to do it. We're not going to take part in it. It would have been tremendous, and it would have expedited the end of the war. But the thing is, the war didn't start in 2022. The war started in 2014 when the United States government, then under the Obama administration, overthrew the elected government of Ukraine. And this is the folly of interventionism. When you intervene in another country, it never ever turns out better than when you started. And I think Trump captured that perfectly in Saudi Arabia with his speech, which was a tremendous speech. And I hope he rereads it. I hope he keeps it under his pillow and reads it every night before he goes to bed, because it was tremendous. The interventionists screw everything up. And they thought, there are a group of people in Obama's administration, many of whose ancestors came from that part of the world, came from Ukraine, and they wanted to settle old scores. Tony Blinken, Victoria Nuland, all of these people, their ancestors came from there, and they wanted to take out Russia because it had this deep-seated hatred for Russia. And so this was their chance, they thought. We're going to overthrow the government. We're going to put someone in charge in Ukraine who's going to be our man in Kiev. And, it's going to be a great, wonderful regime change operation. And it didn't turn out that way. It pushed Ukraine into a civil war. And this is what we're seeing right now. We're seeing the folly of U.S. interventionism, not unbridled Russian aggression. If anything, Russia was on the verge of victory after the war started after the 2014, like in 15, in Debaltseve and different areas that were completely surrounded. And that's when the NATO and the U.S. came out with the Minsk agreements. What was it, +4, whatever it's called. Anyway, so the Minsk agreements
Minsk 2, maybe, yeah.
Minsk and Minsk 2, and that Russia signed stupidly. They signed these and they were broken immediately. And it was a way to save Ukraine when it was on its back heels. So they've learned from that, obviously, and they're not going to do Minsk 3. They're not going to sign a deal like this to stop this. That's why there's been this absurd Kellogg plan. We want to freeze the conflict. No, we're winning. We're not going to freeze. You freeze. So anyway, the conflict is more complicated than it's reported, unfortunately.
This is one question that I'm glad you brought up that Saudi Arabia speech, because I want to ask you something about that too. But these people are not stupid. Okay, they go and get them from the top universities. They were at least smart when they were 18 to get into places like Harvard and Georgetown and whatever. What is this? Is this like an emotional attachment that they have to these policies? Like, why is it they never learn? Is it arrogance? Is it that they're in this bubble where there's no consequences for failing? How do you read like just doing it over and expecting a different result?
No, that's a great point. I think it's all of the above, but you can even bring it down to your local situation. There's always some busybodies in your town who are always trying to make new little city ordinances to push everyone else around. You get that times 1,000, times 1,000,000 when as you point out, you have these arrogant people that went to elite universities and they think that they can move the world. They think that they have the ability, to move mountains, and they just don't. And as you said, their track record is terrible. Everything they touch turns to garbage, and they keep doing it. And I hope Trump was speaking from the heart, and I hope he takes it on board that he needs to look around, because he's got a bunch of neocons all around him in his administration. They're all around you. They're in the room with you, Mr. Trump.
Calls coming from in the house. All right. Yeah, that's what I want to ask you. I just want to remind everybody, Trump's only been president for like 4 months. Okay. It seems like 4 years already. So much has happened. But he makes that speech, and it was wonderful. Daniel McAdams could have made that speech, with a little more polish, maybe. But this is only weeks or maybe a couple of months after he said that the United States should take over Gaza and rebuild it. So how does the same guy make those two speeches?
Yeah, he's bewildering, and I don't know. Maybe you have friends like this, Tom, but sometimes when you have friends that are talking all the time and contradicting themselves all the time, sometimes you just want to end the friendship, and that's sort of how I felt. Very pro-Trump when he came in. I don't vote, but I was happy that he won, and started off great. The Doge stuff started out great, talking about cutting government, cutting USAID. And then he just started getting this kind of hyperactive diarrhea of the mouth, as they say, for a crude term, sorry, but just can't stop talking, contradicting yourself. You just need to take a chill pill and stop all the posting on social media. Just stop it, and move ahead. So I wish this was the cornerstone that he's finally laid down. This will be my foreign policy, but I don't have any illusions that'll be the case.
And he says the word neocons in that speech in Saudi Arabia. He says what you said all your career, and Ron Paul has been saying for 50 years, but then he hires neocons. So is that just pressure from the people who contributed to his campaign? He owes, the Adelsons of the world a certain amount of appointments. How do you read that?
And he even, remember in the previous campaign, he ridiculed Marco Rubio for being Adelson's little puppy dog, and
Yeah.
here hires him. Rubio, on paper at least, is extremely powerful. It goes back to Kissinger when you had a Secretary of State who was also the National Security Advisor, and he's also acting USAID director. This guy's wearing a lot of hats for a pretty unimpressive senator from Florida, so it's pretty remarkable to see. I think maybe the situation with Mike Waltz, maybe that's what woke him up. Mike Waltz is sneaking out behind his back with little Bibi Netanyahu, having a little fling, and Trump didn't like that at all. At least that's what the press reported, and maybe that finally turned him. There's the one thing I think it seems pretty obvious so far about Trump is he doesn't like to be made to look a fool. Is that people tend to be they praise him. He likes that adulation. Maybe that's part of his personality type. But when he feels like someone has made him look foolish, I get the sense, and people have said that really, hits his buttons.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that the kerfluffle with Bibi is genuine then? Probably.
I didn't think so at first. I thought because about a week or so before the Middle East trip, we started seeing all this stuff in the paper. Oh, Trump is mad at Netanyahu. They're having some tension, and I just felt like that was kind of the PR thing. That was a little advanced team stuff to smooth the arrival of Trump in Saudi Arabia, unless the whole thing was so completely choreographed that that was a complete, what's it called, reality TV show. It doesn't seem like that was the case because there was a lot of substantive things that happened, and it also gave Trump the Saudis the opportunity to talk about Gaza, the Qataris the opportunity to talk about Gaza. We don't know specifically what happened, but we do know that Rubio had a call with Netanyahu on Thursday and said, we're concerned about what's happening in Gaza. And that's the first time the Trump administration has expressed any concern about it whatsoever. So he must have gotten an earful. There must have been some truth to all that stuff that was being peddled in the mainstream media about them having some sort of a friction. So it remains to be seen then what happens. The latest thing we're hearing is that Witkoff apparently had promised Hamas that if they release this Israeli-American soldier, that the U.S. will tell Israel to lift the blockade and that they reneged on this deal. I don't know if that's the case or not. That's what Hamas says, if you can believe what they say, for better or for worse. But you can imagine people are starting to talk about Gaza, and it's, 2 years too late, what have you. But they're starting to talk about what's happening there. It's starting to get the world's attention that you're going to have, maybe 1 million people die or something, and it's a big deal. So hopefully the administration will take that on board and do it their own way.
All right. I guess we've got a couple minutes left here, and that's a good segue into the other war that we have to worry about, which is this war with Iran. And it's really strange because on one hand, it's something to really be concerned about. It would not be, some cakewalk. Not that Iraq was a turned out to be a cakewalk after the insurgency and everything. But this would be a serious war that could bring in Russia or China or whomever. But on the other hand, it seems like we're right in the same place we were in about 2005 or six with Bush. And then back in Trump's first term, it seems like every once in a while we're on the brink of war with Iran and then kind of goes away for a while. What do you make of it? Number one, do the neocons really want a war? Or do they just always want to have Iran under pressure? And do you think that Trump really wants to make peace in the end?
No, the neocons want a war with Iran. That was always the main thing. They had to knock off Iraq, they had to knock off Syria, they had to knock off Libya, and they did. You can just check the boxes. But the big enchilada here is Iran. And the Iraq that the U.S. fought in 2003 was an Iraq that had been crippled by sanctions for a decade or more. It was not able, it was running on old technology. The Iran that the U.S. is facing now, besides being many times larger geographically and more complex geographically, is a country that has some of the most advanced weapon systems in the world. And anyone who would doubt that, just watch the Iranian response to Israel on October 1st of last year, when they blew the holy crap out of an Israeli military base and intelligence facility. It's all out there. You can see the video. They broke through the Iron Dome. They broke through all the goodies that the U.S. sent, and they bombarded that completely. As far as whether Russia or China will join in on Iran's side, I seriously doubt that will happen, and I seriously doubt it's necessary. But I'm hoping that someone has briefed President Trump and told him that there are 50,000 U.S. service members within range of Iranian missiles. And if the U.S. starts an aggression on Iran, it will not be very difficult to send 10, 20,000 American boys and girls home in body bags. And for Trump, that's going to be, you're done. That's it. The presidency's done. If you do something so foolish, Americans cannot stand that many casualties.
Yeah, good point. And another good point, because one of the points I was trying to get at is that it seems like we've been here for more than 20 years with Iran. And if they really wanted a war, they would have had it by now. But as you said, it probably Syria, which they've been trying to overthrow for 15 years. You take that off the map because that's an ally for Iran. So now maybe, the road is clearer for them. Is that how you're reading it?
For the neocons, you mean?
Yeah.
I think they view it as their last chance. Their view is they're never going to get a president as in favor of this as Trump, as tied to the hip to Israel as Trump. And Trump is surprising them right now, and I don't know what's going to happen. But I think they thought this is our time. Brain dead Biden wasn't able to do it. Obama wouldn't have done it. But now we've got Trump who's going to do it. That's what I think. The neocons do not have a reverse gear. And this is something that they've wanted. Netanyahu in the 90s was talking about Iran being this close to a nuclear weapon. He's been singing from the same chorus book for a couple of decades now. They're desperate for this war, and they don't care. They don't care how many Americans are killed. It's a war for Israel, not for the United States. It doesn't matter to us whatsoever if Iran is run by the mullahs or by Mickey Mouse. It doesn't matter to us. They're not going to send missiles over to the U.S. It's a war for Israel, and I think more Americans are waking up to this. And there have been a couple of polls so far this year that very strongly suggest that even Republicans are getting very weary of our relationship with Israel. They view it as a one-sided thing, and they don't want to go to war for Israel. And Israel itself now is saying, okay, if you're not going to back us, we'll go it alone. Okay, that sounds like a deal. You guys, we don't wish you any harm, but you're on your own, and that would be fine. So it would be an extraordinarily destructive thing for the United States to start a war. But the thing here is, Tom, there is a deal there. Two things. Trump needs a win. He's botched the Ukraine-Russia thing. He got involved when he shouldn't have. He could have had a quick win there. That would have been great. Okay. But he needs this win. The deal is right there. It's an easy deal. It's not hard, and the Iranian side has already revealed what they want, and it looks fine. And Trump can walk away and say, look, I got a better deal, because the JCPOA was a good deal, but it had a sunset of 10 years, right? So Iran couldn't enrich for 10 years. Now, this would be in perpetuity. So Trump would say, I got rid of that pesky 10-year sunset. I got a better deal for everyone in the region. It's going to be a lot more safe. We've got the Russians going to monitor it. We've got the international monitoring. We've got a reduction. We've got, all of these things. It's a great deal. He could take it and he could, he could walk away and we could start trading with Iran and he would look great. But he's got all these knuckleheads around him who are telling him the opposite. We got to, for example, these 200 senators and members of Congress who signed this letter saying, we're not going to give you a treaty if you don't force them to give up all their ballistic missiles, was not even part of the deal in the first place. You're not going to get a treaty. You're going to get an Obama style deal that the next president can easily back out of. So he's got his own Republicans in the House and Senate working against him on this because they're all funded by the neocons and by AIPAC and all these groups. So we've got a real fundamental problem in America with the way we're governed right now. And I think Americans are starting to waking up to it.
Yeah, it's a separate conversation. We don't have time for it now, but one of the things I've talked about sometime, I'd love to get your thoughts on is why is AIPAC so influential? Okay, they have a lot of money, fine. What can they do with it? And it really doesn't have to do with Jewish Americans because there's only a couple million of them, but you've got millions and millions of American Christians who, I grew up Catholic, that's one version of Christianity, but these people seem to believe that what the U.S. government does will actually play a part in biblical revelations. And to me, that's just crazy, but it is why they're so powerful. Is that how you see it?
Absolutely. It is Christian Zionists who are driving a lot of this, and a lot of Jewish Americans who are absolutely opposed to it,
Right,
who are
right.
absolutely opposed to Israel's policy, and they don't want to get involved. So it's up on its head. As Dr. Paul said one time when he met the Christians United for Israel, and they laid out the terms, the dispensationalism and all this and that, and Dr. Paul sat back, kindly and gently and said, well, in my religion, God is powerful enough that he doesn't need my help to do something that he intends to do.
Right.
So if God wants to end the world, he can do it, right now if that's what he chooses. They're not going to take these people to make it happen. And the real issue is that AIPAC, people, especially Americans, they think AIPAC is such a great friend of Israel. You are not doing Israel any favors by pushing this extremism, because everyone now in the world is starting to hate Israel and they want Israel gone. So under the false notion that AIPAC is helping Israel, they've actually made the physical existence of Israel is more perilous now than it's ever been since 1948. So if I were some Israeli guy, I'd say, thanks, AIPAC. Now, will you please leave us alone because you're not helping us at all?
Yeah. And I think people can't get out of the idea that, let's say before this war in Gaza started, that had the United States stepped away, every Muslim nation would just overrun them in 5 days. But I don't think that's been the case for a while. I think without the United States there, maybe their response to October 7th would have been more measured, with more an eye to, well, look, we got to do something here, but we have to live with these people when it's all over. And it seemed like Egypt, at least the Egyptian government wanted to work with them. And this scorched earth policy that they wouldn't do without the United States behind their shoulder. Yeah, just like you said, it's almost like what the United States did after 9/11. The whole world's on our
Yeah.
side, and then we just go and blow all that goodwill, stomping around the world, making enemies. So, one other thing on the one thing I'll say about Trump, you know, NAFTA, he campaigned against NAFTA, and then when he got in there, he basically opened the NAFTA Word file, put save as, and put a new name, USMCA. I've asked 20 people, what's the difference between the two? And the only thing I've ever heard was like truck parts in some like paragraph 900 or something like that. So he could do the same thing with JPCOA. He could make the same deal, like you said, make it a little better as far as in perpetuity, say this is much better than the old one, even if it's exactly the same, declare victory and move on. I hope to God that's what he does.
Make the deal. There are a lot of extremely well-educated, talented people in Iran. Start trading with them, make the deal and tout that. I brought peace. The neocons wanted war. I brought peace. It would be a great thing. And it's literally this close. But you know how the neocons are. They never give up. They're just planting these poison pills everywhere right now. Even as we speak, they're planting poison pills. So it really will take, if you are a believer in the Almighty, it will take that almighty power to somehow, avert this war.
Yeah, what a great legacy. The neocons wanted war, I made peace. He should, oh my gosh, it's a hanging curve right over the plate. Daniel, appreciate you taking the time. I know you've had a hectic several months there, and hopefully we'll get back together again and see where things are in a little while.
Sounds great, Tom. Thanks so much for having me back on your show.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.